Welcome, listeners. It is the Scruton podcast. In today's episode, our guest is Sebastian Morello, philosopher and senior editor of the European Conservative. In this episode, we are going to talk about conservatism, how it shapes our future and life, since later on this week, there is going to be an event organized by the Hungarian Scruton Hub, an autumn seminar, and Morello is going to be a lecturer there. Well, welcome.
Thank you very much.
My first question would be, in a way, a definition to clearly see what conservatism is, because there are so many different approaches regarding the topic. There's the civilizational conservatism, Christendom conservatism, Enlightenment phase conservatism. How can we understand and is there a common background behind them, and if there is, what it is?
Well, conservatism is famously difficult to define in this sort of propositional way, precisely because conservatism largely arose in the Age of Enlightenment, in the 18th century. The word was coined by Chateaubriand when he founded his journal, The Conservative, in France during the Age of Revolution. And it arose largely to call into question propositional forms of political commitment, what we have come to more generally over the ages refer to as ideological politics. And therefore conservatism suggested a more attitudinal approach to politics, that it wasn't based on a set of a priori abstractions, but that it was based on a certain view of how to live alongside your neighbour, how to take seriously the localism, the place in which you've settled, the history of your land, the shared religious commitments and religious devotions. Now, you might say, well, those are all propositions, but they're not propositions in the sense of some abstract schema to which you're trying to conform the world. That rather, conservatism was always understood from the time of, as I said, Chateaubriand, also in England, Edmund Burke. In France, alongside Chateaubriand, you had people like Bonnard. Maistre was, of course, actually a subject of the King of Savoy, and was a diplomat based in the court of St. Petersburg. So whilst he wrote in French, he would not have considered himself French, but France was his concern. And what was going on with the revolution and the subsequent, the terror as it's come to be known, was his main object of concern. And so you have these writers emerging at that time, and they are precisely trying to move away from a politics that you can define in abstract terms, and they're trying to point to things like shared human psychology, what the corporate person of the nation is, what the history of it is, and why these great endeavours to repudiate all of that emerged in the 18th century with a kind of mechanistic metaphor suggesting that all we needed was a sort of a new manual by which to rearrange society, which, if you like, found its practical expression in the need to write written constitutions for all of these countries, an era which England never fell into, although more and more we've moved towards that by the importation of continental style statute law, but nonetheless, these conservative thinkers were insisting upon a much more organicist, a much more lived, existential, attitudinal view of politics and settlement, rather than something propositional. So there's a way of trying to describe it, if you like, but I'm resisting the idea of giving a set of abstractions for you, because that's precisely what conservatism, I think, has treated with great suspicion down the ages.
Thank you. And what do you think, what may have happened in European societies regarding this conservative approach towards life? I mean, the progressive change in politics, in culture, and what kind of answer may a conservative can give to these questions, given by these new ideas, let's say?
Well, there has been a view ever since. I mean, particularly there are particular culprits, like the sort of anthropology that accompanied the religious views of the great reformers like Luther and Calvin. That there are those who gave the view that man's role in the world is primarily to subject the world to his will and bind it by various technological means that you see rising in the thought of people like Bacon, the Tudor courtier and philosopher. You get that kind of solipsistic individualism obviously arising in the thought of Descartes and so on. But many of them are responding to a current in Western intellectual thought that sees that is not so much conjured up by philosophers. Rather, I think philosophers are trying to give some kind of account of what is already taking place in European society down the centuries, which is that human beings see flourishing to come about primarily by virtue of emancipating ourselves from society, whilst all the while reaping its benefits and its rewards, but at the same time always seeing society as in some way a threat to the emancipation of the individual, which primarily is understood as the moral emancipation of the individual. And it's only a very short step from that view to what we have now, which is that the most flourishing individual is necessarily the most transgressive individual. Now, the assumption has always been that as we move into this progressive, emancipated, transgressive moral paradigm, the effect would be greater and greater peace, happiness, security. People would finally be able to live as their authentic selves. But that's not what we've found. What we found is that this has unleashed a vast amount of pathologies, of insecurities. The fashionable words are trauma and anxiety today. In many Western countries, the number one reason for death among teenagers and young adults is suicide, particularly among men. This is something that we've never seen before in human societies. We're contending with another problem, which comes about through this emancipation of the individual, which ultimately is the other side of the coin from the isolation or atomization or insulation of the individual, which is, perhaps predictably, a kind of chronic loneliness that we're seeing across Western societies, which comes about by virtue of the uprootedness that necessarily accompanies this kind of emancipatory paradigm. And in response to all of that, conservatives have been trying to say something quite different, I think. Conservatives have been trying to say, actually, no, the flourishing of the individual and the uniqueness of each individual comes about not through emancipating yourself from your civilization and your society, but by inducting yourself very, very deeply into that society, by becoming, by a Hungarian becoming truly Hungarian and knowing his national literature and understanding both his folk tradition and his high cultural tradition, by adopting fully the religious dimension of his society, by attending the holy masses on a Sunday and the religious devotions and keeping the feast days, by understanding the rural traditions. Hungary in particular has a very wonderful tradition of hunting and outdoorsmanship and so on. The conservative has always said, actually, if you go very, very deep into your society, then it's there that you discover yourself, because really what you are is the product of this accumulated community. It's from this community that you came forth. And if you try and strip yourself down from your culture, your education, your family formation, everything, what you will discover is not the unique, emancipated individual, the amazing, totally irreplaceable self. You'll just find that there's actually nothing there. And it's interesting that as people have moved into this progressivist, emancipatory moral paradigm of modernity, people haven't discovered that actually, when they're fully emancipated, everyone's completely different. Everyone's turned out looking completely the same, with the same blue hair and ripped clothing and tattoos and stretched ears and so forth. And so actually, either way, you're going to end up with some kind of conformity, because we share a species kind, and we are in the end animals that belong together in our communities. You're going to get some kind of conformity as a consequence. The question is whether it's going to be a conformity to the good and to flourishing and to something wholesome and something that's worth conserving, or whether it's going to be a conformity to something that's purposeless and meaningless and in the end nihilistic. And since we've experimented for some time now with the latter, what we have is a chronic unhappiness crisis in the West. And we've now exported that unhappiness crisis to almost every part of the globe. And we're particularly doing that at the moment through new technologies. In the face of all of that, conservatives have been saying, pretty much since the Age of Enlightenment, or rather the so-called Age of Enlightenment, conservatives have been saying, be careful here. This is not going to end in a happy conclusion. Human beings flourish and become truly themselves by a completely different path. And if you like, Roger, with whose various artifacts we're surrounded with here, he was a perfect example of that. He was somebody who really understood that to become fully himself, he ought not to emancipate himself from English culture and English society, but induct himself deep into it. So he went fox hunting and he ran a farm and he became part of the great institutions of the country. So that's a tentative answer.
You mentioned the religious heritage within conservatism. What would you say? Is it necessarily a Christian approach to be a conservative, or there exists another kind of conservatism, which is a civic one without the devout faithful content.
Oh, I certainly think that it's possible to have conservative convictions or assumptions or prejudices, by which I mean nothing negative. It's perfectly possible to have a knee-jerk view of the world in favour of conservatism, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. You might even be able to provide certain fairly decent reasons for having that. But in the end, it will always be a house built on sand, because the conservative precisely takes the organic unfolding of community and the natural primordial constitution of human beings and the history of nations and all of these things very seriously, because whether in a clear and acknowledged way or in a sort of unexamined, assumed way, the conservative has some kind of providentialist conception of the world. He thinks that the world in which he has found himself is one pregnant with meaning and purpose, and that it is being, in this fatherly way, cared for, and that we, as we move in our pilgrim journey through this world, are being guided and led, like the Hebrews through the desert by the great pillar of cloud. That the conservative has some kind of intimation of that, and that's why he takes the view he does, and that's why he looks in horror at attempts to repudiate that history and that pilgrim journey of mankind instantiated in his particular civilizations and nations. So in the end, I think that the conservative, if he is to be truly honest with himself, has to have some kind of, dare I say, mystical or religious conception of reality. Now, does that have to be Christian? Well, in a sense, no, because we know that conservatisms of other nations, non-Christian nations, have existed. The Japanese, for example, who have more recently repudiated their culture and entered into the same nihilistic paradigm as much of the world, which is why the Japanese are very close to now going extinct, because they haven't replaced themselves. They're essentially a nation on the verge of committing suicide altogether. But traditionally, the Japanese had an extremely conservative and hierarchical way of life that was not itself that was not itself Christian. It was based on the Shinto piety, the popular Shinto piety, the Zen Buddhist practices of the monasteries, often which was admixed with Shintoism, and the kind of law and honor based approach to society that was largely an effect of the samurai culture. That was a kind of conservatism. I don't think anyone could deny that. And actually, this is a point that John Henry Newman makes at the end of his book, The Grammar of Assent, which is that Christianity presupposes natural religiosity. All human beings are naturally religious. We have an impulse to find the cause and the meaning and the purpose and the finality of our entire existence. And once we've found it, we want to worship it. We're all naturally religious. And for Newman, at least, the great error of the 18th century was to take the true natural religion of the pagan nations, as it were, and replace it with a kind of phony natural religiosity of the philosophers, which in the end becomes this kind of bizarre performative stuff of the cult of reason and so on. And whilst we might think it's ridiculous that they fell into that trap of worshipping Lady Reason in Notre Dame and so on, in fact, what we have today is a kind of strange cult of reason that blocks out from its purview some of the most elementary aspects of human experience, like our natural piety and our mystical view of the world. So I think you can have a conservatism that isn't Christian, but I don't think you can have a conservatism that isn't religious, in the way that I don't think you can really have a human being that isn't religious. You can have a human being that's not honest with himself about that, but you can't really have a human being that's not religious. What I would say, though, is that just as I see Christianity, because I am a practicing Christian, just as I see Christianity as both fulfilling and superseding natural religiosity, so I think that conservatism, only if you like, becomes fully itself as an account of human nature when it becomes part of a broader Christian worldview. I think that's what I'd want to say on that.
Let's remain within this topic. I would like to mention two books. One is The Soul of the Liturgy by Joseph Ratzinger,
Yes.
and the other one is The Soul of the World by Scruton, Sir
Yes.
Roger Scruton. May it be said that the decline of holiness and liturgy is in a way in parallel with the decline of, let's say, Western European civilization? And if so, shouldn't we re-evaluate and try to rediscover these liturgical practices and heritages?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up those two books, both of which have been quite important in my own intellectual formation. My book that was published in 2021, I think, A Conservatism and Grace, published with Routledge, made great use of Scruton's The Soul of the World. Yes, I mean, Ratzinger's liturgical thought has also been of importance to me. I think one of the big mistakes that Christians have made, largely since the Reformation, but especially since the 18th century, is that we have thought of religion primarily as propositional. We've thought of religion as long as you assent to these particular doctrines and dogmas and propositions of the faith, then you have the faith. And as I always used to say to my students, whilst it is certainly true that in order to maintain a good friendship, part of that will be believing truths about your friend and disbelieving untruths about your friend. So I'm not saying that doctrine and dogma or propositional faith claims are not important, but in the end they are secondary. They are secondary because a friendship is not simply constituted by belief in truths about your friend and disbelief in untruths about your friend. It's spending time together, it's talking, it's having experiences together, having wonderful meals together. A friendship is not about your friend, it's with your friend, it's to your friend. It's an I-thou experience rather than a second personal experience. And that's what religion primarily is, if it is true religion. It's not simply a collection of propositions. It's the ongoing love affair of the creature with his creator and the creator with his creature. And that is primarily expressed in ritual. It's primarily expressed in ceremony. It is among the great Greek philosophers of the Mediterranean, many of them at least, it was expressed in theurgical activities, going into the sacred caves and the sacred, onto the temenos, the sacred ground, and entering this mystical encounter with the divine. And if you like, theurgy baptized is what Christian liturgy is. Christian liturgy, you enter the sacred temple, you call down the deity onto the altar, and you commune with him. And you ought to go away transformed as a consequence. We've lost that sense. So now liturgy, or the Sunday service, or the Sunday Mass, or whatever it is something that you kind of do out of duty because you're expected to by the church, but really you have the faith because here are a set of doctrinal propositions and you've said yes to each one of them. So we have reduced religiosity. Largely the Western mind has reduced religiosity to acceptance to a set of abstractions. And therefore, religion has largely become a kind of species of ideology. And often that's how it's talked about. You have all sorts of podcasters and popular apologists seeing Christianity as, if you like, one of the means by which we can do battle with socialism or secular nationalism or wokeism or whatever it is. Whereas actually what true religion is supposed to be is not one ideology among many. It's meant to be the escape route out of the entire ideological paradigm and into truth, into communion with the Creator, of whom the created world is an emanation and in whom it participates. So my own view is that somehow we need to recover the primacy of the mystical, the liturgical, and the existential in religion, and recognize that propositional religion is important but actually secondary. And I don't think that the soul of the West is recoverable if that doesn't happen. And it can't really happen through arguing about it as I have now, but it will come about by beautifying our liturgical practices again, recovering the ancient sacred languages of liturgical Greek and Latin, of shifting liturgy away from a kind of late modern mutual self-affirmation session, as so much of it is today, and back to a mystical worship of the Creator. And once you do that, people will come. And it's interesting to see how the ancient Latin Holy Mass of the Catholic Church, which currently the Vatican and the Curia are trying to destroy, that is attracting vast numbers of young people. Huge numbers of young people want to attend it, because it turns out that in the great meaninglessness and nihilism of late modernity, young people want to worship because they want to fill their lives with meaning and purpose again. And they can't seem to do that in any satisfactory way through a kind of liturgy that was, largely thought up by a dubious cleric in a 5-star Swiss hotel. That is not that is not how true religion emerges organically down the ages. From a conservative analysis, I would say that such a liturgy is a deeply revolutionary liturgy. And so people want something else. They want to tap into the ancient sacred activity of the ages. Unless we recover that sense of religion, that religion is mystical and not primarily catechetical, then I don't think we can recover the soul of the West.
Thank you. So last question I would like to ask about your personal memories about the late Scruton, since you wrote your doctoral thesis under his supervision. So what was it like to work with him What are your personal impacts?
Well, yes, he supervised my my master's research degree and my doctoral degree, so I was enormously fortunate to really have him as my mentor for my entire postgraduate experience. He was an amazing teacher. He was not keen to tell his students what they ought to be reading and researching, but rather he wanted to tease out the nascent interests in his students and see how he could, because in the end, when you're doing a doctorate in particular, you've got to sustain a fascination with the topic for a 3 to 6 year period, you know, depending on how quickly you can get it done, which is a fairly sizable chunk of time to remain fascinated with, say, one pressing question. And Roger was he was keenly aware that his students had to find a topic that really fascinated them, and then his job was to foster that and suggest the right texts to sustain that interest. And so, in a sense, he was a kind of he was an exemplary mentor in that way. But he was also, you'll very often, when you meet students of Roger's, they'll often refer to him not simply as a mentor, but as a friend and mentor. He was extremely caring. People wanted to be around him. You would sort of hang on his every word, you know. Extremely funny, a very dry sense of humour. Very, very amusing, and just wonderful company. And the thing is that his other students and I use his books now as a kind of constant treasury from which to draw, because he left us this incredibly rich corpus. And there's just a lifetime to meditate on there, as these works were indeed the fruit of a lifetime of philosophical and religious meditation. So I just feel hugely privileged and hugely fortunate to have had that time with him. And I'm very impressed by the way that in Hungary the torch is being carried, and you're doing great and wonderful work to disseminate as widely as possible the importance of his thought in this country. It is perhaps slightly unfortunate that his intellectual legacy seems to have been taken up in a popular way only in Hungary and not really anywhere else. But then it would be a lot worse if it were nowhere. So it's fantastic that it's happening here. And I hope that you know, young Hungarians are inspired by what they read in his works, and that there are some wonderful practical fruits of that in the future.
We hope so. Thank you for your time, and thank you for these insightful thoughts you shared with us. It was Scruton Podcast. Thank you for listening to us.